I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as US officials continue their proximity talks in Saudi Arabia with delegations from Ukraine and Russia, we look at the most recent report from the United Nations, which exposes new, widespread and systematic war crimes against the civilian population.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 24th of March, 3 years and 29 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by our executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley, and later you'll hear from the UN's Commissioner, Pablo de Greiff. I started with the latest military updates from Ukraine, Russia, and beyond. Let's start with the big news today, which is delegations from the US and Russia are holding talks right now. They're said to have started in the last hour in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, in what is being characterised as negotiations over a Black Sea ceasefire. Now, I'll ask Francis a little bit later quite why they're being framed like that, as a Black Sea ceasefire. But more on that shortly. Now, these talks obviously come after the US team met Ukrainian officials last night in the city, in Riyadh, for another round of talks. Now, Ukraine, you'll remember, has already agreed to Donald Trump's proposed 30-day ceasefire, but as that was rejected by Russia, and as that rejection was met with no punitive action by the US, despite Trump signalling he'd forced Moscow to accept the deal, we're all expected to pretend that negotiations are going smoothly and easily. Hence, we've got more talks in Riyadh. Now, President Zelensky said his delegation to yesterday's talks had worked in, quote, a completely constructive manner. Now, I think that's diplomatic language for neither promising anything nor being overly provocative. But Mr. Zelensky did say, no matter what we say to our partners, we need to get Putin to give a real order to stop the strikes. And that is the rub right now. There was no real change to the front lines over the weekend. A few small Russian advances near Toretsk and Ukrainian advances in Luhansk and in the vicinity of Pokrovsk, all very small. But strikes across Ukraine continue to result in civilian deaths and injuries. Now, despite Donald Trump saying over the weekend that efforts to stop further escalation were, quote, somewhat under control, over 300 drones were fired at Ukraine across the weekend. Saturday saw drone strikes kill and maim civilians, including 7 in Kyiv, 2 victims being a 5-year-old girl and her father, and a family of 3 were also killed in the Donbass. Yesterday, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha condemned Russia's continued attacks on civilians following the mass drone attack on Saturday night. Yesterday, writing on X, he said Russia's systematic and deliberate terror against civilians contradicts its own statements about peace and undermines peace efforts by the US and other partners. Now, the longer this cycle goes on of Trump claiming great progress with his phone calls and saying there's huge restraint from Russia, all these things being shown literally the same day in many cases to be at complete odds with reality, the more I think Donald Trump's going to be looked to be, well, not in control of events or not able to influence events and out of touch with reality. And that is not a good look for a US president who apparently is such a great deal maker. Anyway, the US team under Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is in talks right now with the Russian delegation, and hugely constructive they will be for Putin, if not for world peace. But more on the diplomatic front from Francis shortly. I'll give you some more military updates from the weekend. Now, on Saturday, Lithuania, following Poland's lead actually, announced plans to fully mine its border with Belarus and Russia. So Dovilė Sakalienė, who's the head of Lithuania's Ministry of Defence, said she had discussed the integration of the Eastern Shield and the Baltic Defence Line with her opposite numbers in Poland and Finland. Lithuania, you'll remember, is bordered by Latvia to the north, Belarus to the southeast, Poland to the south across the Suwałki Gap, and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad to the southwest. Now, the roughly 50-kilometre Suwałki Gap is so named because of the Polish town nearby. That's the Suwałki bit. And the gap refers to it being the bit of land that separates Belarus from Russia, Russia being the Kaliningrad exclave. Now, it's considered one of the potential flashpoints in any future test of Article 5. In a statement, the Lithuanian MOD said, quote, during such meetings, a discussion was initiated on the renewal and expansion of the counter-mobility concept. Following the example of Poland, the northeastern flank wall can be fortified with several layers of fortifications, including but not limited to anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. The regional partners intend to seek EU funding to achieve this goal. Now, this move comes as Poland's Deputy Minister of Defence, Pablo de Greiff, said Poland might deploy anti-personnel mines along its border with Russia and Belarus as part of the Eastern Shield project. And the wider context, you'll remember, is last week's recommendation to their respective parliaments by the defence ministers of Poland, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia that they should withdraw from the Ottawa Treaty banning personnel mines. Okay, also on Saturday, Donald Trump announced Boeing had been awarded the contract to build the US Air Force's new fighter jet as part of the NGAD program. That's the Next Generation Air Dominance. So the new jet is going to replace the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor. And braking convention is apparently going to be numbered the F-47, as Donald Trump is America's 47th president. Now, he denied picking the number himself, saying, quote, the generals picked that title. And I'm absolutely sure they did, knowing that's the way to get presidential sign-off. They've obviously done their human terrain mapping. Well done, lads. I'm just a little disappointed that NATO has already given the Russian Su-57 a designation, as that code name would have been perfect for a new jet named after Donald Trump. Okay, still on Saturday, and Czech President Petr Pavel said his country is ready to join a future peacekeeping mission in Ukraine. So Mr. Pavel, who was in Kyiv on Friday meeting President Zelensky, having just left Odessa, during which time Russia launched a drone strike on the city, he warned that, quote, the biggest threat to European security was and still is Russia. Now, as a result of that, he signalled his country would join Keir Starmer's proposed coalition of the willing. Speaking to European Pravda on Saturday, he said, we are part of this coalition now. If there is a strong group of European nations willing to provide security guarantees to Ukraine, my strong conviction is that the Czech Republic should be among them. Now, just on this coalition of the willing stuff, it's worth noting the Chinese Foreign Ministry has denied reports from German media outlet Die Welt on Saturday that, citing unnamed diplomatic sources, said China is also discussing sending troops to be part of any post-war peacekeeping force. So Zhao Jikun, who's the spokesperson for the China's Foreign Ministry, told reporters, I'd like to emphasize that corresponding reports are absolutely false. China's position on the Ukrainian crisis, interesting word, is consistent and clear. He said Beijing is seeking to continue working with the international community toward peace talks and creating conditions for a ceasefire and ending the conflict. So neatly down the middle of the road, as they often do. Die Welt had quoted an unnamed EU diplomatic source as saying, quote, the inclusion of China in a coalition of the willing could potentially increase Russia's acceptance of peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. I think the word could is doing a lot of the heavy lifting there. Saturday also saw President Zelensky visiting troops in forward headquarters in Pokrovsk and Kharkiv. And then this morning, up to date this morning, Ukraine's destroyed 4 Russian helicopters in a HIMARS missile strike. Ukraine's special forces released footage showing the US-made missiles blew up 2 Russian Ka-52. I think that's the Alligator, isn't it? But they're the attack helicopters, and 2 Mi-8 helicopters. Mi-8s are troop carriers, but they also can fire munitions. So are they attack or not? I think they are generally designated as not as attack helicopters, but hey, they can still cause a lot of damage. Now, they were destroyed, all 4 of them, in Russia's Belgorod region. In a statement, Ukraine's special forces said, once again, Russia thought deep rear positions were unattainable. We proved that nothing is out of reach for Ukraine's special operations forces. Now, also this morning, the deputy commander of the Achilles Unmanned Systems Regiment told Ukrainian media outlet Suspilna that Ukrainian forces have reclaimed part of the territory near the village of Dvorichna in Kharkiv Oblast, about 100 km east of Kharkiv city. Daricna is located on the western bank of the Oskil River, about 20 km north of Kupiansk. Now, Russian forces have been trying to get across the river and get a foothold on that bank for months, seeking to outflank Ukrainian defences and pressure Kupiansk from the north and the kind of northwest to get around behind the lines. Ukrainian actions were described by the deputy commander as very important but small operations, thanks to the Kyiv Independent there for reporting. The reason I mention that, it was a very small piece of land that they retook, but because of its significance with the river there, I thought that was worth bringing to your attention. A couple more from me. That massive blaze at the oil pumping station in Russia's Krasnodar region, just east of Sea of Azov, continues to rage for the fifth day after being hit by Ukrainian drones last Wednesday. The fire, we are told, has spread to 2,000 square metres, with one of the storage tanks and the oil products inside still burning, according to local authorities. Russia's MOD said, quote, Ukraine keeps attacking Russian energy infrastructure. Now, clearly, as we said on Friday when we were chatting with James Rothwell, they use this language. They are trying to establish the narrative that there is a ceasefire in place regarding attacks on energy infrastructure, and therefore, according to Moscow's logic, Ukraine is in breach of the ceasefire. So, to be clear, there is no ceasefire. Russia rejected the idea of a 30-day all-encompassing ceasefire. They floated the idea of a temporary ceasefire on energy infrastructure, but A, nothing of the sort has been agreed to, and B, Russia has continued strikes against Ukrainian energy infrastructure. So we can ignore their bleating and just move on. Also this morning, last one from me, Ukraine's state-owned railway Ukrzaliznytsia said it had been subjected to a large-scale cyber attack. Restoration of the online systems is ongoing, the company said, and despite the attack, train traffic has been stable and running without delays. If there's one thing you want to put your money on in this life, it's that Ukraine's railways will always run without delay, unless you are travelling with the great David Knowles and the wee Egypt has lost his ticket, an incident which still gives me flashbacks. Now, Francis, these talks in Riyadh, I said at the top, they are being framed as working towards a Black Sea ceasefire. Now, I reckon that's because that's the area where Ukraine is really hurting Russia, and hence the only thing Putin's willing to discuss right now. But what's your take?
Thanks, Dom. I'm inclined to agree, and I should add that those talks between the US and Russia in Riyadh are now in full swing, according to one of Moscow's delegates an hour ago, with interesting discussions taking place on quite pressing subjects. That's what we're hearing, though we have no more details than that yet. We know more about the nature of the talks between the US and Ukrainian officials in Saudi Arabia last night. As you say, infrastructure and shipping safety. Kyiv called the meetings constructive and beneficial, with Serhiy Leshchenko, one of President Zelensky's aides, revealing that the delegations discussed a possible pause on strikes against both Ukraine's and Russia's port infrastructure. So, to quote the presidential advisor, the discussion concerned a mutual ceasefire. We won't attack their facilities at sea and rivers. They won't attack our facilities, our Kherson and Mykolaiv ports, the greater Odessa ports. Now, as you say, Dom, this is somewhere Russia would love to see an alleviation of pressure, hence why, no doubt, this is a subject both are willing to discuss. But both are still accusing the other of breaching that partial truce, which was, as you say, if one takes President Trump's words at face value, supposed to begin immediately. In fact, it seems there's been very little let up at all in those kind of strikes, as you were just describing. Despite that, Washington remains, apparently, optimistic that Monday's summit in Saudi Arabia could pave the way to a full-on ceasefire and bring an end to the entire war, with them aiming for a truce by Easter Sunday. That's the 20th of April. That is the view of Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who gave an extraordinary and sobering speech to Tucker Carlson at the weekend, and I'll go into that in a moment. However, I should just say that the Kremlin is playing down those optimistic expectations, suggesting that difficult negotiations lie ahead. We are only at the beginning of this path, Dmitry Peskov warned, less than a week after Russia rejected Trump's last offer of a 30-day ceasefire. For once, and I can't quite believe I'm saying this, I agree with Pesky Peskov, at least in the sense that it's hard to see meaningful progress towards a lasting ceasefire in the short or medium term for all the intractable reasons we've discussed in recent weeks, at least not a meaningful, lasting ceasefire. It would appear, though, that Washington and Moscow are inching ever more closely towards each other's positions, underscoring that Europe must prepare for a scenario when it will be on its own in supporting Ukraine, a subject we'll be returning to in more detail this week. The Steve Witkoff interview with Tucker Carlson should be, I think, essential listening in European capitals. It is so revealing about the relationship between Trump and Putin, and indeed the administration's approach towards the Kremlin. Witkoff said that during his second visit to the city, Putin had commissioned a portrait of Trump and actually gave it to me and asked me to take it home to him. He told me a story, Tucker, Witkoff said, about how when the president was shot, he went to his local church and met with his priest and prayed for the president, not because he could become the president of the United States, but because he has a friendship with him and he was praying for his friend. Witkoff said that he had recounted Putin's story to Trump and then handed over the painting. He was clearly touched by it, he said. Witkoff also threw cold water over Europe's attitude towards the Russians, accusing the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer of adopting the simplistic notion that leaders have all got to be like Winston Churchill, believing the Russians are going to march across Europe. I think that's preposterous, he said. We've got something called NATO that we did not have in World War II. I would say yes, a NATO which Trump has criticised time and time again. The vast majority of European leaders are not saying that they expect the Russians to march across Europe, rather to work and conduct combinations of conventional and hybrid warfare to influence or seize parts of Central and Eastern Europe, just as they have been doing, not only in Ukraine historically and indeed with the full-scale invasion, but also if you look at Moldova and Georgia and other places. And that's before one even gets into the sabotage, which we've been reporting now for the best part of 2-3 years. But I'm afraid it got worse. Witkoff, who, lest we forget, was a real estate developer with no prior diplomatic experience, was unable to name the partially Russian-occupied territories of Donetsk, Kherson, Zaporizhia and Luhansk, misnaming the last one completely and confusing Crimea as being one of those contested regions. Most troublingly of all, he said the occupied territories had held referendums where the overwhelming majority of people had indicated they want to be under Russian rule. He's recognising the illegal, internationally dismissed referenda which took place in those territories after the full-scale invasion, often at gunpoint. I remember that because we covered it in detail at the time, and the whole thing was a horrific spectacle. There was nothing democratic about it. Witkoff also fell into the trap of believing that just because people speak Russian, they must be favourable to Moscow. As we've said before, try telling that to the citizens of Kharkiv we spoke to a few months ago, to the men and women who've seen their Russian-speaking neighbours killed by Russian guns. This is not naivety from Witkoff and company. This is clearly ideology. He said in the interview, "I don't regard Putin as a bad guy. This is a complicated situation, that war, and all the ingredients that led up to it." I would just say, remember those words when you listen to the interview with the UN Commissioner shortly, describing some of the most horrific acts of systematic violence we've reported on in the entire war. But that's where we are, Dom, in the political realms today.
Thanks, Francis. Let's go on to our final thoughts, and I will start off. I'd like to say thank you to a listener who got in touch with us here at ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk, and as I say, we do read every message. Now, I won't name the listener for reasons that will become obvious. Anyway, This person from the United States wrote to us and said, I regularly make small donations to Ukrainian charities, mostly through PayPal. The last time I did this, with a $20 donation, I received a phone call from the bank connected to my PayPal account. They had been contacted by the US government Office of Foreign Asset Control. Apparently, Ukraine has been placed on a list of hostile countries, so contributing to Ukrainian charities is now deemed suspicious behaviour. The Office for Foreign Asset Control demanded to know where I had sent the donation and how I'd been contacted by the charity. Now that sounds very odd and something that we should look at, so thank you for writing in. I would like to gauge whether this was a one-off overzealous bureaucracy perhaps, or a whole new policy. So I appeal to you. Have any other listeners had similar issues with their bank and or the Office of Foreign Asset Control when donating to Ukrainian charities? Thanks again to the listener for bringing this to our attention, and please do let us know, folks. Francis, what do you got?
Well, Dom, I won't lie to you. The interview you're about to hear is a hard listen, but one that, for me, is one of the most important we've done for some time. Thank you to all of you for not looking away when so many others are, including, clearly, some of the most powerful people in the world. History, I'm certain, will not judge them kindly. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine was established by the Human Rights Council of the United Nations in March 2022 to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law in the context of the aggression against Ukraine by Russia. Its previous reports concluded that Russian authorities used crimes against humanity, describing the use of sexual violence and torture in detention facilities. Its latest report, however, goes much further, exposing new, widespread and systematic war crimes against the civilian population. Since its establishment, the Commission has interviewed 929 women and 851 men, examining documents, expert and forensic reports, photographs and videos. Commissioner Pablo de Greiff, a Colombian academic and human rights activist, is one of the 3 UN commissioners who authored this report. Please note that my interview with him features some of the most graphic descriptions of human rights abuses, including sexual violence, we have ever featured on Ukraine the Latest. The full report will be in the episode description. Commissioner, anyone following this war for over 3 years might think they've seen and heard it all in relation to war crimes, yet this report is as visceral as it is shocking. I wonder if we could begin by going through some of the key findings, heading by heading, starting with enforced disappearances. What is the core finding of your report in that first?
So, Francis, let me start by thanking you for the interest and now getting to your question directly. Perhaps the most important finding of this report is that the Russian Federation is committing crimes against humanity of enforced disappearance. And in order to reach that determination, you and your listeners will know that you need to establish that the practice is widespread, that it is systematic, and that it responds to a policy directed against the civilian population. Those are 3 different elements of the crimes against humanity, and we are absolutely confident that we have sufficient evidence to reach that determination. If I may make an additional remark in response to your introduction, we had already found that the Russian Federation had committed crimes against humanity of torture, and we had reported that to the General Assembly in October of last year. So, yes, this report is very, very strong and very shocking, but so was the one that we presented in October to the General Assembly, and some of the others that we had presented before. We had in total given 10 presentations to either the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council, and all of them in reality contain horrors, although in these two last ones are the first ones where we reach the determination about crimes against humanity, which is particularly strong.
I'm going to read a short extract from that first section that covers what you were just talking about. Families describe the anguish of seeing their loved ones being detained by Russian soldiers without knowing the reason, where they were held, and how they would be treated. For instance, in March 2022, as Russian armed forces occupied a village in Kyiv province, they searched houses and detained a man and his 20-year-old son. The wife and mother of the victims cried, pleading for an explanation, ran after the military vehicle that took them away, implored the soldiers to release them or to share some information with her, but they ignored her. In another case, during a house search that occurred around the same time and in the same province, Russian soldiers detained a man and his adult son, a journalist, in a local makeshift detention facility. After a few days, a Russian soldier took the son away. When his father asked where he was taking him, the soldier responded, "When the war is over, your son will come back." The family has received no information about his whereabouts since then. Commissioner, when you're getting testimony like this, can you just describe a little bit about the process of acquiring it and how unusual it is to get this kind of testimony in UN reports?
So the process of getting the testimony, as you can imagine, is painstaking. I have to say that the relationship with victims leading to testimony of this sort is one that is essentially one of trust building. You need to be trusted by people to disclose extraordinarily painful events in their lives. And they have to trust that you are not going to misuse the information and the experiences that they share with you. There are, of course, formal protocol that we follow with a great deal of care. For example, every one of the staff members of the Commission has received training to avoid re-traumatizing victims in the process of interviewing them. All victims, of course, are asked for their informed consent about what the Commission can do with the information that they provide for us. And there are victims that say, I am happy to share information with the Commission, but I don't want the information to be disclosed to anyone else. There are others who say, you are free to share the information I am sharing with you with other legal entities or procedures. So there's a range of options, but the point that I want to emphasize is that there are, of course, formal protocols that need to be followed in order to be careful with the information. There are, of course, protocols also about how to store the information in order not to increase the risks to victims in sharing information with us. So, for example, in our databases, names and testimonies are never in the same place. So even if someone was able to break into one database, they would find either a list of names or a list of numbers and separately lists of testimonies, and it would be very, very difficult to put these together. So again, we are extraordinarily careful about this. We have, uncharacteristically for UN reports, insisted on using quotations from victims. Again, trying to be careful about not identifying the victims or making it easy to identify who they might be. But we have insisted in using quotations because we felt that it was important to give voice to the victims, to let them speak for themselves, because we don't want this to be taken as a mere bureaucratic exercise. The reports, of course, have to conform to certain guidelines that are unavoidable, but nevertheless, we wanted the victims' voices to be present.
Now, I've got a question about culpability in this report. Of course, it's talking about individual soldiers, not by name, but there is, I think, a broad thread throughout the report talking about responsibility higher up the chain. Who do you hold overall responsible in Russia for the crimes we were just talking about?
In this report, as in other reports, what we have chosen to do is to talk about institutional structures. In this particular case, we state, in accordance with the evidence that we have received, that the security services, the so-called FSB by the Russian initials, are mostly responsible for the cases of torture and enforced disappearance, that the investigative committee, which depends on the Ministry of Justice, is also responsible for those. And from the very beginning of the establishment of the commission, we have built up a list of individuals, but that list we have not made public and will eventually be turned over to the High Commissioner of Human Rights directly. But as far as institutional responsibilities, we say, again, because we think that we have sufficient corroborated evidence to do so, that the FSB is largely responsible for the crimes that we are talking about here.
In one example of the testimony of torture conducted by the FSB and other entities, you write as follows. Another civilian woman who had also been confined in another facility of the same province recounted that during the night, a soldier who appeared intoxicated came to her cell and ordered her to undress, touched various parts of her body and raped her. She screamed. Other soldiers who approached mocked her and encouraged the assailant. The next night, 2 soldiers came to her cell, ordered her to remove her clothes waist up and to squat and jump on a table while they threw lit cigarettes at her and poured water over her. When you were putting this report together, it's obvious that gender-based violence is one of the key areas of investigation. Could you just comment on that and how, again, you approach that subject?
Yeah. So in past reports, and in particular in the report we presented to the General Assembly in October of last year, we had concentrated on sexual violence against male inmates in detention centers. And the reason why we had done that was that, of course, the majority of detainees happened to be male. In this report, we concentrate much more attention on sexual violence against women under detention in particular, because we were looking for evidence of the detention of civilians. And of course, there are many more civilian women under detention than in the past report, where we were concentrating on prisoners of war specifically, who again are overwhelmingly male. So this is, again, the second big topic in this report, showing the absolutely horrendous abuses to which civilian women were subjected under detention, and the many ways in which violence, particularly violence with a sexualized dimension, is used against them. And in addition to the rapes and the humiliation and the forced nudity, we also examine other gendered dimensions of the treatment of women under detention by the Russian Federation. And just to remind your listeners, these are people under detention both in areas that have come under control of the Russian Federation in Ukraine, but also people that have been transferred from Ukraine to detention centers in the Russian Federation. And in those places, the practices are very similar. This is what we talk about, a systematic form of mistreatment. And I was talking about other gender dimensions of the mistreatment. For example, denying women the availability of hygienic products and mocking them, mistreating them when they were menstruating, or asking them to rip off pieces of bedding material in order to use instead of hygienic products. So there are all sorts of manners in which gender plays a specific role in the way in which women are mistreated and humiliated, going beyond forms of rape and forms of invasive bodily searches, for example, or the humiliation that women are subjected to when on the occasions in which they are allowed to shower, forcing them to be nude in front of male guards or other male inmates of the detention center. So the catalog of forms of mistreatment is long and extensive.
You record one case of a woman who was subjected to heavy beatings and gang rape when she went to the local police to inquire about her relative. And more broadly, you say that in all investigated detention facilities, some of the most brutal forms of torture have been used. These include severe beatings, electric shocks, burns, strangling, suffocation, hanging, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, as well as other acts. Of course, there's another area in the report, which is executions. And you say that the Commission interviewed 48 former soldiers who deserted from the Russian armed forces. The majority participated in combat operations in Donetsk, Kharkiv, Kyiv, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia provinces. 11 among them described direct orders or instructions by their commanders not to take prisoners. In most cases, they also received orders to kill them instead. Another 15 of the interviewed soldiers heard accounts from fellow soldiers concerning such orders, instructions, or practices to not take prisoners. I wonder if you could comment on that and indeed the sharp increase in the number of executions in 2024.
Yeah, so again, this is the third large topic that we pursue in the report. And I have to say that I am extraordinarily proud of the investigatory team because former Russian soldiers who had deserted from the forces is, as you can imagine, not an easy task. And getting them to disclose information of this sort is particularly difficult. And therefore, I think that this constitutes a huge success for the investigation. And as you say, we got direct and corroborated evidence about basically giving the enemy no quarter. We take no prisoners. In one of the cases, brigade commandant said, we do not take Nazi prisoners. Nazis ought to be shot, not to be imprisoned. And this, of course, is one of the clearest violations of one of the oldest laws that try to humanize conflict that human beings have known. And that is, of course, that you do not kill prisoners of war. Prisoners of war have a protected status, and therefore this type of order, we do not take prisoners, we kill them, constitutes a war crime without any doubt whatsoever.
I should add that whilst the vast majority of cases of war crimes in the report are Russian, there are some relating to Ukraine. It says the report also describes some violations of human rights law committed by Ukrainian authorities against persons they accused of collaboration with Russian authorities. I wonder if you could comment on that, in a sense, discrepancy between the two sides, because, as I say, it is overwhelmingly Russian in this report. But can you talk about the Ukrainian side of this and that disparity?
So we take the impartiality and independence of the Commission very seriously, and we have not been shy to report about violations by the Ukrainian side when we have found the evidence of it. With respect to collaboration, the issue is the following. The criminal code in Ukraine was reformed in order to add 2 articles on that criminalize collaborating with the enemy. The difficulty is that those 2 articles do not define collaboration very precisely, and therefore the end result has been that lots of people that, strictly speaking, have not committed any crime against, for example, national security or territorial integrity, or that have given modes of collaboration that could have endangered other Ukrainians, have become the subject of criminal investigations. So let me give you an example of many that the Commission has received. When the Russian Federation was gaining a terrain in Ukraine, a school teacher, for example, was told by the Russian Federation, by the occupying power, if you want to continue teaching in the school, and this might be, for example, someone with the children, an elderly parent, totally dependent on her salary, and without the opportunity to move. So she was told by the Russian authorities, if you want to continue teaching, you need to become part of the Russian civil service. Having no option, she does, continues teaching, and eventually the area is recovered by Ukrainian forces. And then she becomes the object of a criminal investigation for having collaborated with the enemy. In our view, and this is something that we have expressed to Ukrainian authorities in the past, the problem lies with the fact that the 2 new articles in the criminal code that criminalize collaboration ought to be brought up to international standards. These ones do not, and therefore they lend themselves to abuses. And to be honest, those criminal investigations are sometimes accompanied by illegal detention, different forms of harassment, and therefore those are violations, and as a consequence, we report on them as well. One has to be clear, of course, that here we are talking about completely different universes, both of magnitude and of gravity of the treatment in question. So the numbers are very different. The subjects of criminal investigation, although sometimes, as I said, illegally detained and even harassed, they are not disappeared as it has happened so often and in such large numbers with Ukrainian victims. But nevertheless, our task is to report on violations that take place in the context of the aggression, and therefore we faithfully discharge our mandate by reporting those violations as well. You also mentioned cases of Ukrainian forces injuring or shooting and presumably in some cases killing Russian Federation soldiers. And we have some reports of those, and some of them, in fact, have been posted as videos on the web. And to the extent possible, we have carried out investigations about them, not always successfully being able to close the cases, because I must reiterate yet again that the Russian Federation has refused to collaborate with the Commission. We have asked 31 times for information, and most of those occasions concerning Russian victims, and not one of those requests has ever been responded to. So we open up the investigations, we report as much as we can, but there is a dearth of information because we do not get collaboration from the Russian Federation.
In the report, you talk about an instance of something we've covered on the podcast, which is wounded soldiers injured by drones, then being killed by drones. Now, obviously, that involves no human beings being near them and pulling a trigger, but a drone dropping something off them after they're injured. I wonder if you can comment on the ways in which this war, in a sense, the law is having to catch up with the reality of the technology, because you obviously in the report criticize this, and understandably so, but of course this is different territory now, and presumably there will be some who will say that it would be impossible to safely get to that wounded soldier, and the fear would be that they would become a future threat and that they are still a combatant. So I wonder if you can just comment on that ethical dilemma raised by incidents such as this.
Yeah, so I think that this is very unfortunate. But I am of that generation that did not grow up with electronic games. But nevertheless, I have children and I am familiar with electronic games. And the absolutely horrendous truth is that both sides have engaged in the practice that you just referred to. Both sides have posted on the web incidents in which clearly injured soldiers of the opposite forces lying down on the ground are filmed by an overflying drone and then fired upon either with bullets or with explosives. And the films are made in such a way as if they were a game. So different points are given for different types of forms of killing. There's background music, as if this was nothing more than a game. And again, unfortunately, I have to say that this is a practice that seems to be common to both sides of this conflict.
A couple more questions, if I may. What happens next? This report has just been published. What would be the legal avenues that would be a consequence of this? And what happens within the UN itself now that this report is published?
So what happens next is really not a matter for the Commission to decide. The Commission has a mandate that is renewed on a yearly basis. So we are coming to the end of the third mandate of the Commission. There is a resolution that is being considered in the Human Rights Council to renew the mandate of the Commission one more year. But that is entirely up to the members of the Human Rights Council. This will take place in the first week of April. On the assumption that the mandate is renewed, we will continue with our investigations. There are plenty of issues that remain open. For example, we have from the very beginning of the Commission been very interested in examining the consequences for civilians of the Russian Federation's attack on the electrical and thermal infrastructure in Ukraine. And that is a case that we have not closed at all. So one can anticipate that this will be something that we will continue to investigate. Unfortunately, the huge variety of violations of the laws of war that are taking place in this conflict. There are plenty of stories about Russian Federation soldiers, prisoners of war being mistreated in Ukraine. We have interviewed several Russian soldiers that claim to have been mistreated. We have unfortunately not been able to corroborate those testimonies, and we have a very, very strict criteria of corroboration. But this is, of course, something that we are interested in. And depending on the course that the conflict takes and the opportunities that we have for investigation, we will carry on with our work, doing the best that we can, with the certainty, sadly, that everything that we report is nothing but the tip of the iceberg of what is really happening. This is a conflict in a huge country where the arms of choice are not small firearms, but rather missiles, bombs with a high explosive power used in civilian areas, and therefore the horrors are too numerous for this short interview. But sadly, we would not be out of work if the mandate is renewed.
As you say, this testimony is the tip of the iceberg. I wonder if, on a personal level, as somebody who's worked in this field for so long, what's your reaction to the speculation that the US-funded report into children, stolen children, which has been closed since the White House took over, the latest administration, may have deleted files and testimony permanently? I mean, as somebody who's spent so long acquiring this and spoken very eloquently earlier about the challenges, how do you personally respond to that?
So I don't want to respond to a speculative claim, but I will just say in general that someone who has spent almost 30 years of his life in the conviction that the least we owe to victims is to collect evidence about what happened to them, because they did not perish in a natural disaster. They were killed as a result of decisions made by others, and that therefore, again, the least that we owe to them is to record their fate. The idea that information about them is erased is an offense to what I think is minimally decent behavior. Of course, international law not only requires and gives to victims the right to truth, it is much more demanding. It also gives them a right to justice, a right to reparation, and a right to non-repetition, to non-recurrence. So if you cannot even satisfy the right to a truth that has already been collected, we are really in very, very bad shape with respect to fulfilling international obligations, legal obligations, not to speak about obligations of morality and basic human decency.
Commissioner, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Francis, and congratulations for your work and keeping this issue alive. I think is very, very important.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.